Good day, everyone, and welcome to our presentation titled Possibilities, Preferences, and Choices. Today, we'll be diving into the fascinating world of consumer choice theory. We'll explore how budget lines and indifference curves serve as essential tools for understanding how households make purchasing decisions. I'm excited to take you through these concepts and see how they help explain everyday economic behavior. Let's get started. When households go shopping, they often want to buy many different goods, but their choices are limited by their income and the prices of those goods. To help explain how people decide what to buy, economists use concepts called budget lines and preferences. The budget line shows all the possible combinations of goods a consumer can afford, while preferences reflect what they like best. Together, these ideas help us understand how consumers balance their desires with what they can actually afford. This balancing act is at the heart of how consumers make their choices. Here, we see a line graph that illustrates the budget constraint between two goods, which we refer to as good A and good B. The budget line shows all the combinations of these two goods that a consumer can afford given their budget. On the x-axis, we have quantities of good A, and on the y-axis, quantities of good B. Notice how as you increase the amount of good A you purchase, the amount of good B you can afford decreases. This trade-off happens because you have a limited budget. For example, if you spend all your budget on good B, you can only afford 10 units of it and 0 units of good A. Conversely, if you spend all your budget on good A, you have 0 units of good B. Any point along this line represents the maximum combinations you can buy without exceeding your budget. Understanding this budget line is key because it helps explain consumer choice and how people allocate their limited resources among different goods. Here, we have a line chart that illustrates the concept of the budget constraint. On the horizontal axis, we see the quantity of good A, and on the vertical axis, the quantity of good B. The budget line itself shows all the possible combinations of these two goods that a consumer can afford, given a fixed budget. As the quantity of good A increases, the quantity of good B decreases, which is why the line slopes downward. This slope represents the trade-off between the two goods, essentially how many units of good B must be given up to purchase an additional unit of good A. Understanding this trade-off is crucial for analyzing consumer choice and optimizing utility within budget limits. Here we can see how changes in income affect the budget line, which represents the combinations of good A and good B that a consumer can afford. On the x-axis, we have the quantity of good A, and on the y-axis, the quantity of good B. The two lines represent different income levels, lower income and higher income. Notice how the higher income line is further from the origin, allowing for more of both goods to be purchased. For example, when consuming 6 units of good B, someone with higher income can afford 15 units of good A, compared to just 10 units for someone with lower income. This clearly illustrates that as income increases, the budget line shifts outward, expanding the consumer's purchasing possibilities. Here we have a line chart that illustrates how a change in the price of good X affects the budget constraint. On the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of good X, and on the vertical axis, the quantity of good Y. The original budget constraint is represented by one line, while the new budget constraint, after the price change, is shown by the other line. Notice how the budget line rotates inward or outward, depending on the price change of good X. This rotation reflects how the consumer's purchasing options shift. When the price of good X decreases, the consumer can afford more of good X for the same budget, expanding the possibilities. Conversely, if the price increases, the budget constraint contracts, limiting the quantity of good X the consumer can buy. This visual clearly demonstrates the direct relationship between price changes and shifts in the budget line, which is fundamental in consumer choice theory. Here, we're focusing on understanding preferences and utility in the context of household satisfaction. Preferences help us rank how happy a household is with different bundles of goods or services. The key idea is utility, which economists use to represent these preferences. Even though we can't directly observe utility, a higher utility value means the household prefers that bundle more. Essentially, utility acts as a way to quantify these preferences and helps us analyze choices in a structured way. The image here, showing a person in a storage area with various food items, ties into the idea of selecting bundles based on what satisfies needs best. Here we see three indifference curves labeled U1, U2, and U3, representing different levels of consumer satisfaction. Each curve shows combinations of quantities of good X and good Y that provide the consumer with the same level of utility or satisfaction. Notice how, as we move to higher curves, like from U1 to U3, the quantities increase, indicating higher overall satisfaction. The key concept is that consumers are indifferent between any points along the same curve because they deliver equal satisfaction. This visualization helps us understand consumer preferences and how they make trade-offs between two goods while maintaining the same happiness level. Here we see an indifference curve illustrating the trade-offs between good A and good B. As we move from left to right along the curve, notice that the quantity of good A increases while the quantity of good B decreases. This captures the concept of the diminishing marginal rate of substitution. Essentially, the more of good A we have, the less of good B we're willing to give up to get an additional unit of good A. The slope of the curve changes along the way, reflecting this changing willingness to substitute one good for the other. This diminishing rate highlights how consumers balance their preferences between two goods to maintain the same level of overall satisfaction. Here we have a line chart illustrating the concept of consumer equilibrium through the interaction of the budget line and three different indifference curves. On the horizontal axis, we measure the quantity of good X, and on the vertical axis, the quantity of good Y. The budget line represents all the possible combinations of these two goods that the consumer can afford given their budget constraints. Notice how it slopes downward, reflecting the trade-off between the goods. The indifference curves show different levels of satisfaction or utility for the consumer. Each curve further from the origin represents a higher level of satisfaction. Consumer equilibrium occurs where the budget line is tangent to the highest possible indifference curve. In this chart, you can see that indifference curve 2 touches the budget line at the point where the consumer maximizes their utility without exceeding their budget. This tangency point is significant because it represents the optimal combination of good X and good Y the consumer chooses. Understanding this balance helps explain how consumers make decisions based on their preferences and budget constraints. Here we see how changes in income affect consumer choices. On the left, with lower income, the consumer is constrained to a lower indifference curve, meaning they have limited purchasing power and must choose a bundle with less consumption of both goods. On the right, as income increases, the consumer moves to a higher indifference curve, reflecting their greater ability to spend. This allows them to select a new bundle with more of both goods. Assuming these goods are normal, essentially, higher income expands their choices and improves their overall satisfaction by enabling more consumption. When prices change, consumers often adjust their buying habits in two key ways. First, there's the substitution effect. This happens when a price drop makes a product relatively cheaper compared to others, encouraging consumers to buy more of it, instead of alternative items. For example, if the price of asparagus drops, people might choose to buy more asparagus rather than other vegetables. Second, we have the income effect. A change in price affects the consumer's overall purchasing power. If prices fall, consumers effectively have more money to spend, which can lead them to modify their entire shopping bundle. These two effects together explain how price changes influence buying patterns in the market. Let's look at the key takeaways. First, budget constraints define the combinations of goods a consumer can afford based on their income and prices, setting the boundaries for their consumption choices. Next, indifference curves represent consumer preferences, illustrating combinations of goods that provide equal satisfaction and helping us understand what options are preferred within those budget limits. Finally, the optimal decision is found where the budget line intersects with an indifference curve, showing the best choice a consumer can make. Changes in income or prices shift these lines and curves, which in turn alters consumption patterns. These concepts together give us a clear picture of how consumers make choices within their means.